What are we learning from the Russians, or very little, about their inability to stop this counteroffensive? At this point, that the Ukrainians control hundreds of square kilometers of very sensitive and symbolic, Russian territory.
First of all, the most obvious thing I think that has resulted in a thus far slow and ineffective Russian response to this, their command structure and the bitter rivalries between all the different organizations and institutions inside of Russia.
What's your assessment of the troop expertise or just general training on the Russian side?
Well, the key will be, for the Russian side, are they able to mass enough artillery and rockets to pound away at Ukrainians and then try to drown the Ukrainians in Russian corpses? I mean, that's basically the Russian approach, is just to attrit, to wear down. Because they don't care about their own losses, they're willing to just keep pushing and pushing and pushing. But key to that.
This is The Global Gambit.
Welcome back to the channel, everybody. My name is Piotr, and this is the Global Gambit, where we look at and reimagine the West's place in the world and sort of the nexus of geopolitics and the global economic system. Now, Ukraine and Russia and the war is probably the main thing that we cover on a reoccurring basis here. And someone who I think has been one of the most prominent voices throughout, and I'm incredibly delighted. He needs no introduction, I think, is what I would say, is General Ben Hodges, who is a retired US State Army officer and has been advisor to Human Rights First, NATO, and he's one of the most distinguished members of the US military, put it that way, and I'm absolutely honoured to have him join the show, and I'm very much looking forward to this conversation about developments in Kursk, Russia's responses, and then maybe a little bit further down the line about China and the bigger picture. But General Hodges, thank you very much for joining the show. I hope you're getting on all right. I think you're in Germany, yes?
Yeah, I live in Frankfurt. Just got back from 6 weeks in the States for the summer. Good to be back home here in Frankfurt.
Yes, no, it's and I'm very, as I say, delighted to. One of the first things you were like, yes, I'll come and join that Brit in the London show. So I think very quickly, I'd like to learn from you your immediate reactions to the developments in Kursk. Obviously, yesterday was one of the largest missile and artillery barrages we've seen across Ukraine by the Kremlin in quite a while. So maybe just sort of your initial reactions to the lay of the land, so to speak.
Well, I think this Kursk counteroffensive by the Ukrainians has achieved already 3 or 4 important things. Number one, it has changed the narrative of the war, that somehow a Russian victory is inevitable. The Ukrainians are changing the narrative about what's possible. They have created a very difficult domestic problem for the Kremlin. Now, what we can't tell have they achieved the effect that they wanted, which is to draw forces away from other Russian efforts, such as in the east, the Russian offensive going against Kursk. Cannot tell yet whether enough forces have been drawn away from that to lessen the pressure on the Ukrainians out in the east. But I've been impressed with the Ukrainian General Staff, with how they have managed so many different things, despite having inadequate resources from the United States, from UK, and other Western countries. If you think about it, this counteroffensive in Kursk is not a standalone thing. It's not happening in a vacuum. I mean, while the Ukrainians are doing this, and they pulled off a massive surprise against Russian forces and surprised us as well, they are continuing to launch long-range precision strike against Russian airfields, Russian oil and gas infrastructure, and also, of course, they destroyed one of the most important ferry links between Crimea and the Russian mainland. So this counteroffensive is a part of Ukrainian-style multi-domain operations.
So one of the things that I think a lot of people are reflecting on is the longevity of such an incursion campaign, operation, whatever people prefer to call it. But I think what has been illustrated is that the Ukrainian, shall we say, retraining and complete restructuring of the military in the past 10 years or so has been significant. And I'm just kind of curious from your perspective with that expertise, in the time that you led the US military in various capacities. How do you reflect on the progress and evolvement that the Ukrainian military has shown in its operation?
Yeah, the first thing you mentioned, Peter, was the what do we call this? The Ukrainian government and the general staff have done a good job of protecting information. We're not entitled to know exactly what they intend to achieve, how long they're going to be there, but the word incursion does not sound adequate given the scale and what I think the objectives are.
What do you
I
think they
think
are?
and it's not a raid, obviously, because it's much more significant than that. So I have been calling it a counteroffensive because I do believe that the primary purpose of this is to slow down the Russian offensive against Ukraine. So this is a counter stroke, if you will. But that's for the labeling of it. It does matter because the words do have different meanings,
Certainly, they do.
regardless. Yeah.
No.
So
Sure.
how long are they going to stay there? Well, of course, that depends on what is the ultimate end state that the general staff and the government hope to achieve. My sense, and again, this is only speculation because they haven't laid it all out, nor should they. My sense is that they are trying to create a buffer to deny a large area on the Russian side of the border that has been used by the Russians for launching attacks against Ukrainian civilians. So, and because the United States and UK and Germany have not allowed Ukraine to use long-range weapons against targets inside Russia, the Ukrainians which by the way creates sanctuary for the Russians.
Mm-hmm.
The Ukrainians are saying, okay, well, we're going to move the line then. And so by going deeper into Russia, they can bring their own weapons further forward and start striking Russian targets deeper inside Russia. So that's what I think is one of the principal objectives they're trying to accomplish. Now, I believe the point of your question, though, was about the evolution of the Ukrainian armed forces.
Mm-hmm.
For sure, when we first started working with them about 10 years ago, well, that's not true. We had Ukrainians with us in Iraq and Afghanistan, so there were cooperation with Ukrainian forces. I'm still dear friends with a Ukrainian officer I met almost 20 years ago in Iraq. But there still is a legacy of Soviet mentality and Soviet education in some parts of the Ukrainian forces. The vast majority of the obviously younger officers, the troops, the units have either came in after that or they've shaken that off. But there still is a little bit, I think, some residual thinking that's got to be eliminated. General Zaluzhny was working hard to eradicate that when he was still the chief of defense. But of course, they're in the middle of a war for survival. And so institutional reform is not necessarily at the front of mind. I do think that one area where the Ukrainians have got to improve is what we call the institutional army. This is the part of the army that's responsible for recruiting, training, education, all the stuff that's required to put operational forces into the field. Mm-hmm. And this means you have to dedicate quality, experienced officers to be faculty, for example, at education, or quality, experienced sergeants to help be trainers. And then you have to have quality people that are out there recruiting so that families have confidence that if their son or daughter joins the Ukrainian armed forces, they won't be sent into the fight until they are properly trained, properly equipped, and put into a unit that is ready to go fight.
So you mentioned about the sort of mentality and its remnants of the Soviets. I do want to touch upon Soviet doctrine, but after this question, though, which is that for me, it's a bit of a catch-22 in that I look at the current counteroffensive, if we call it that, and the developments are, on the one hand, good because it shows you the successes the Ukrainians can make, but they haven't communicated that with Berlin, London, let alone Washington, right? Barely anyone knows, including the Kremlin. But at the same time, they did that largely, I think, because of the underwhelming success of the 2023 counteroffensive, right? But at the same time, if they're not telegraphing in any way, shape, or form what they plan to do, could that not be a potential hindrance to sustained support by NATO, the US, because they're like, well, we're not sure what Ukraine's going to do unless they tell us first. So is there not a potential limitation by keeping things under wraps that it might limit, how far a new administration is willing to go? Or you disagree with that sentiment?
Well, first of all, I think you made an important point, reminding everybody of last year's counteroffensive. I was overly optimistic myself, but I think the Ukrainians learned from that. Number one, they have to do it their way with what they have, versus trying to do it the way Americans or Brits might have pushed them to do it without providing them the stuff that Brits and Americans would be using, such as air power. So the Ukrainians have to do it their way. Secondly, I think they were very suspicious and careful about talking too much about this, because for sure, if too many people inside Washington or London or Berlin knew about it, the Russians would have absolutely known about it. I mean, that's just the way these things are. And so the discipline with which they maintained operational security really impressed me. The fact that almost all of us were totally surprised, the fact that they could get so many troops up near the Russian border without being detected and then blow through the border forces, that impressed me. And you have to have disciplined operational security. I spoke to someone the other day who said that, to a Ukrainian, who said that they had talked to soldiers who found out the day before where they were going. That's exactly the way it should be down at the troop level. Otherwise, you've got people get on their cell phones and they start calling home and say, "Hey, we're going to do whatever." So I was impressed.
So, okay, now I mentioned Soviet doctrine. So this is obviously, we touched upon the vertical commands, horizontal. So I'm kind of curious from your perspective, though. There are remnants of what you're saying is the Soviet doctrine in the Ukrainian forces, but it's obviously still basically what has been prescribed in the Russian approach to things. Putin has a very strong hold, I think, despite being a terrible master strategist, to quote one online sort of parody account, right? What are we learning from the Russians, or very little, about their inability to stop this this counteroffensive at this point? That the Ukrainians control hundreds of square kilometers of very sensitive and symbolic, Russian territory. What are we learning about the Russians' ineptitude here?
There's two or three things that come to mind immediately that should give us optimism, and that should also inspire or drive how we support Ukraine to be successful. First of all, the most obvious thing I think that has resulted in a thus far slow and ineffective Russian response to this is their command structure and the bitter rivalries between all the different organizations and institutions inside of Russia. The border forces belong to the FSB, and then you have Rosguardia, and then you have the general staff and the regular forces, and even inside regular forces, you've got conscripts, you've got mercenaries, you've got professional like the VDV and the naval infantry, who used to be the most respected and capable Russian forces. All of these groups hate each other. The general staff has no interest in seeing the FSB be successful or seen as the heroes for saving things. Yet the Kremlin put the FSB in charge of dealing with the Kursk counteroffensive. So I think there's probably a lack of coherence in the command structure in how they assess and how they respond. That's number one. That's to the advantage of us and Ukrainians. And so playing on those divisions and hatreds and rivalries, I think that's a vulnerability for the Russian side. The second thing is related to that, the logistics. Before this war started, I was really impressed with the ability of Russia to move a lot of stuff real far, real fast. Trains, large aircraft, gazillions of trucks, etc. that transport. Now, that logistics system is under enormous pressure, partly because of the losses they've suffered over the last 2.5 years, but also, again, with this command structure, somebody at some level has to say, okay, priority is now eliminate the Kursk salient, and you send these forces here to here. So that's when the clock starts on marshaling the trucks and trains and things that are required to move thousands of troops with all their stuff and ammunition to where it's needed. And it is several hundreds of kilometers from the Pokrovsk area, for example, around to get up to the Kursk area. That is a challenge. And especially if you were not anticipating the requirement. Even Russia will have some challenges marshaling enough transport to do that quickly. And then finally, the third thing, we have been reminded that the Russians absolutely do not care about losses, how many people get killed. That it means zero. And so how many Russian troops are killed is not a good metric or indicator of success. The only metric that matters is Putin, does he believe that he's winning or losing? And do people around him believe that he's winning or losing? Because losing, of course, is unacceptable in that system. And so I think that the objective has to be something that creates big pressure on him and on the people around him versus counting how many Russian troops have been killed. I will add one caveat to that. Conscripts. If you've got young men from Moscow and St. Petersburg that start getting killed and captured, that will be different than the 600,000 men who have been killed or captured that are from everywhere else inside the Federation.
Well, it's almost like you foreshadowed, you knew what I was going to ask you next, but it was about the kind of individuals, the kind of demographics that we're seeing from the Russian perspective take on the sort of, shall we say, stalling and intercepting of this counteroffensive. I very much agree with your sentiment about the internal dynamics of the Russian side. There's a great video on YouTube from the Imperial War Museum here in the UK, and its emphasis, of which I think most people agree, it was the FSB led the initial all-out assault, right, on February 24th, with the anticipation that they would administer sort of the main key areas of Ukraine, and then the general sort of military would come in and bolster that. But it was first and foremost a security-led operation, not a conventional military. So it was a shell, a husk of what it really should have been to take on sort of the extent of land and territory that they were trying to do. As you said, I think the northern border and around Kursk is being predominantly managed by conscripts who've had 2-3 days worth of training, whilst the seasoned quote unquote military are still around Pokrovsk and other parts of the Eastern Front. What's your assessment of the troop expertise or just general training on the Russian side, and what could this mean for them in terms of losses and engagement with the Ukrainians?
Well, the key will be for the Russian side. Are they able to mass enough artillery and rockets to pound away at Ukrainians? And then try to drown the Ukrainians in Russian corpses. I mean, that's basically the Russian approach, is just to wear down. Because they don't care about their own losses, they're willing to just keep pushing and pushing and pushing. But key to that are headquarters that can control this, and endless amounts of artillery and rocket ammunition that allow them to pound away at Ukrainian defenses. And drones, I would include drones inside that. So those are kind of the three components of Russian offensive operations. And so, General Kvoli Sakir, he said that you can defeat mass with precision if you have enough time. And of course, what he's talking about, to defeat that sort of Russian style that I just described, you need long-range precision weapons that can destroy headquarters, because the headquarters are required for this very centralized form of attack. And then you need long-range precision that can destroy the logistics, the ammunition that is delivered by trucks and trains. And then you need the long-range precision to take out the artillery and rocket launchers, or also the airfields. So you You don't have to have the ability to kill all these unlucky young soldiers that are attacking you, but with precision, you can destroy the headquarters and the artillery that makes it possible for this poorly trained, unhappy, unlucky infantry to overwhelm your position. So this is what the fight is. I think you've got a very centralized system versus a system that is more decentralized on the Ukrainian side. What the Ukrainians lack is enough endless long range precision strike capability.
What about the Russian mothers and sort of grandmothers, as we saw in the Soviet operations in Afghanistan, and then with the Chechen wars? I think one of the biggest domestic pressures that no one really, particularly the Kremlin, didn't anticipate was that motherly sort of love pressure of the loss of their young boys. Do you think that could come? But it's been an omnipresent, I think, people for saying, "Oh, this is going to be a factor for the Kremlin to consider." But do you think that this could really become more of a pressure if we see the meat grinder, so to speak, really becoming a thing in Kursk with conscripts as well?
That's a great question, and it's something I have tried to understand now for the last couple of years. At what point do Russian people say that's enough? I think this is not about their resilience. This is about a lethargy and a system where the people doesn't really matter that much. I don't think we're going to see something like the mothers from Afghanistan who were able to bring enough pressure on the government because I think that the Kremlin has tried to avoid that sort of situation. The most of the people that they have recruited to join the military come from out in the much poorer ethnic regions of the Russian Federation, where for somebody out in one of these areas gets a huge amount of money, relatively speaking, to come be a private in the Russian military. And if they get killed, the family, I hate to say it, profits from it. So you don't have a lot of funerals taking place in Moscow and St. Petersburg. That's when that starts happening, then I think you will see a change in the dynamic. But so far, they have been able to avoid recruiting too much out of the two major metropolitan areas.
Yeah, no, for sure. If you start sort of saying the more urban settled populations, that's when it really begins to change. I think the Snow Revolution of 2012, when we saw that huge protests against the Putin restructuring of the constitution, is symbolic of that. And also I think it's different to like the Soviet time because it was the Soviet Union beginning to crumble. You had the internal dynamics. There was that ability to pressure the government in a way that Putin's hold on power is precarious at times, but still definitely not that fragile. But